Kudos to you for being here and listening to this Bright Talk. This provocative question, are you enabling or disabling your sales team, is often the elephant in the room, and I applaud you for being open to examining this with me. Before I start, let me just say right up front that no sales manager, no sales director sets out to disable the sales team. I totally get that. What happens, though, is that well-intentioned managers with good ideas and incredible pressures to deliver results inadvertently, without even realizing that they're doing it, they sometimes disable their sellers. So that's what we're going to shine the light on. I'll review survey results with you, tell you some stories, share data, and offer you some tips to inspect and change whatever it is that's not serving you well in sales enablement. Over the past 30 years, I've been in your shoes. I've worked with thousands of sales managers and frontline sellers. I'm Deb Calvert, author of the bestseller, Discover Questions, Get You Connected, and of the award-winning blog, Connect to Sell. I train and coach salespeople and sales managers about connections with buyers and about practices that improve sales productivity. Speaking of connections, please be sure to connect with me on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter, or Google+. My handle is on screen along with my email address. I also work in the leadership space as an executive coach, and these two disciplines, sales and leadership, they converge in my current work, which you may know is the movement to stop selling and start leading. Like most of my work, it's based in research with buyers and sellers. In fact, some of the information that I'll share with you today is based on a survey of sellers and what their managers were doing to enable them, as well as what their managers were inadvertently doing that disabled them. Now, we've all heard this ugly phrase, sales prevention manager. And unfortunately, it's becoming a fairly common phrase that I hear. And whenever I hear it in a group of sales managers, the response is that certain kind of laugh that means it's not really funny because it's just a little bit too close to the truth. So if your job is cluttered with lots of work that doesn't directly link to enabling the production of revenue, your effectiveness is compromised. Your role may have been blurred in the ways that you see there on screen. So as much as possible, get your partners in other departments to do the support work. Focus your efforts on the more direct involvement that's necessary to create value, drive productivity, train, coach, forecast, and so on. And yes, in what you see there in red, please stop selling. Get enabled and capable salespeople to sell, and then get out of their way. Do your job so that they can do their job. If you'd like a copy of this graphic, please note that it's in the attachments file on your Bright Talk screen. There are some other goodies in there. I'll tell you about those as we go through the presentation. And if you want more information about this entire topic, take a look at my LinkedIn post. Another great resource that talks about this is Mike Weinberg's book, Sales Management Simplified. It's one that I highly recommend. Okay, we're going to come back to this whole idea of getting your job set up correctly at the end of the webinar. I just wanted to show you this to say I understand what you're dealing with, but now let's move into the main topic, and we'll make a full circle loop at the end. Back to sales enablement, defining the term. What you see in italics on the right-hand side, that's the dictionary definition. To the left are examples of activities and the sorts of things we do to provide for sales enablement. Certainly there are many, many definitions of the term sales enablement on consultant websites and in blogs and elsewhere. In this presentation, I'm planning to stick to the basics, the way that you see them presented here. So sales enablement simply means enabling sales. Any activity or effort or product that supports making sales counts as sales enablement. To enable means to make able, to give power, means, competence, or ability to make possible or easy, to make ready, to equip. Sales enablement includes the work that you and your organization do to make salespeople able, to give power to sellers, to increase the competencies or abilities of your sellers? All that fits in the examples you see there, like training and coaching. Sales enablement also means that you're making sales possible or easy. In other words, you're providing systems or processes that make it easier, not harder, to make sales. And then finally, sales enablement means that you're making sellers ready to sell, and you're equipping them for the work of selling. Some examples would be that you are providing tools, technology, and resources that prepare sellers to sell. Okay, so now we've clarified what I mean by that term, and it does sound pretty simple, right? Well, defining it's the easy part. That's only the tip of the iceberg. The truth is that sales disablement is rampant, and most of the things sales managers do that disable sales are actually meant to do just the opposite. By the way, to disable means to make unable or unfit, to weaken or destroy the capability of, to incapacitate, to cripple, to make incapable. So, of course, no sales manager intends to weaken or incapacitate their own sales team. No one wants to be labeled as a sales prevention manager. But I see this happening with alarming frequency. So let's talk about why and how it happens. If you think about all those items we just listed as enablers, then we'd have to put that side by side with this moment of truth question. How many of those things, training, coaching, systems, processes, tools, technology, resources, how many of those are taking time away from selling? This really is a delicate balance. Although these are all necessary sales enablers, each one can potentially become a disabler if not used thoughtfully and in a way that is balanced to allow for adequate selling time. If not in balance, sales time is eroded, hence the statistic, the sad statistic that you see on screen. Of course, that scary little number on screen, that's just an average. Some are spending more, and some are spending even less than a third of their time on selling. I don't think that's okay in most sales organizations. But unfortunately, there's even more to the story. I'm including this slide and this factoid to stir up that pot just a little bit more. To me, one of the most tragic examples of missed opportunity is rolled up in this finding. And you already know this. Right? Set up correctly and used appropriately, a CRM system can truly enable sales by empowering and equipping your sellers with easy-to-access information and a streamlined process. So why then? Why is the rate of adoption so low? Why do sellers often resist CRMs? Why do so many companies invest in them only to abandon them or to hip-hop from one to another? Let me give you a quote. This is from a high-tech sales veteran who answered that question in our survey. Because the best salespeople want to be measured by results, not activities. Those who manage by activity level need to realize that one went out in the 70s, but there are some who continue. They should look at that old IBM proverb, never confuse activity with results. And I know, I can already hear your yeah buts and your indignation, but I also hear similar sentiments from a lot of sellers, and you probably do too. The CRM is misused or misunderstood, and it does eat up a lot of time if it's not used wisely. I'd like to tell you a story about a sales rep that I shadowed for 4 hours. His manager wanted some feedback on how to boost his close rate. The sales manager thought the problem was that he needed some closing skills. So for 4 hours, I watched this rep extract and enter information into his CRM, and I took tallies, and he entered information or extracted information a total of 54 times in 4 hours. In between, he made a few phone calls, but he was disabled, not enabled by the tool. He was focused on metrics that were linked to the CRM, number of dials, time between contacts, and an internal factor that the CRM had a role in too as well, like he had to tag new prospects to claim them in the system before anybody else did. So it was this inordinate amount of time looking up every prospect, tagging those who weren't already claimed, logging the dials, reporting on what transpired, inputting follow-up timelines, and so on. Now, I thought maybe he was just dodging the live calls because I was shadowing him and he didn't really want to be that vulnerable, but he wasn't. This was his routine and pace all day, every day. So the problem wasn't how to increase his close rate or how to get in some closing skills. The problem was we needed to enable sales to get him into a place where he was balancing the use of these tools and that technology more appropriately. But here's the main takeaway of that story. Just about every seller has had some sort of experience like that. So the perception of many sellers is that technology and tools that you're providing are little more than time-sucking ways to spy on them. And I know this because I conducted this survey of sellers, and that was the number one complaint that they shared. Now, please don't misunderstand. I am in favor of CRMs and technology that support and enable sales. I'm offering that example, and if we had more time, I could offer similar examples for every one of the sales enablers that we listed a moment ago. So that's the rather bleak start to the presentation. Stick with me. We will get to a more positive place. But before we do, I want to give you all 10 of the sales disablers that were most frequently reported by sellers. The survey itself, by the way, was done with 250 sellers in various places, online primarily, and their responses confirmed what I've collected anecdotally and less scientifically in the field over the past few years. After I share those 10 top sales disablers, according to salespeople, I'll give you 5 ways that you can enable sales instead of accidentally disabling them. So remember, our objective here is to help you think about ways that you might inadvertently be disabling sales rather than enabling them so that you can find some solutions. I can't move into the 10 disablers without clarifying that you are the one in control here. As a sales manager, your actions have an immediate and direct impact on sales performance. So ultimately, the real question to keep asking yourself throughout this presentation and after is, am I enabling or disabling? Am I expecting sellers to do things that work against them and make it harder for them to simply sell? And at the same time, sales managers, that I'm saying this is up to you, I'm also empathizing with all the competing demands that you're juggling. I'm not here to blame or shame anyone, only to heighten awareness so you can determine what you can do for your team. So here we go, and they're not in any particular order. These are the top 10 disablers according to sellers. Think about how you can be liberating sellers from these disabling constraints whenever possible. The first one, no surprise here, reports, paperwork, what used to be paperwork and is now online, but it still feels like paperwork. Let's look at this from multiple perspectives. Sales managers want and need reports to track performance and activity standards, to satisfy senior management, and to complete their own internal reporting, and so on. And senior sales directors, they want and need reports so they can stay plugged into the action and minimize any surprises. And other team members want the sales reports that are going to affect their own workload or have an impact on the part of the business that they're responsible for. These are all valid reasons, but it's a slippery slope and it's easy to get carried away. You might want to ask yourself on any given day, how many minutes do you want your sellers to spend on entering data so someone else can use it? And how often have you asked, or really, how often have you examined how every report is generated and used by others? Chances are there are some less essential and maybe even some totally useless reports floating around out there. Your sellers might be spending time compiling and entering information that is frivolous. Let me give you an example. This is a quick one. The weekly expense report required by one company had 42 fields to be completed. So I asked the finance people what was the purpose for gathering information like the taxi driver's board licensing number. And after a few half-hearted attempts at defending those required fields, they did acquiesce. The form got revised. There are now just 10 simple fields to enter. So I haven't calculated it, but can you just imagine how much time this saves for every single seller? And if you multiply the minutes for one seller that it saves every week by every seller in that organization, well, the number's probably pretty impressive. What could you be doing to examine processes and then to minimize, streamline, and eradicate reports and paperwork that are disabling your sellers? That's the question to think about. Here's the next disabler. This is an extension of the last one, but it involves conversations too and time spent in meetings, not just reports. How often are you asking sellers to look in the rearview mirror versus looking at what's in front? How much time is spent discussing what can't be changed, what may not even be relevant anymore? See, many sales forecasts are based on history instead of being based on potential. Instead of enabling sales in the present and future, you might be disabling sales by living in the past. All those lagging indicators, they're just data points. And sure, they have value, but maybe that value is more as a management tool than as a selling tool. So I'd caution you against burdening reps with time spent on calculating or information gathering related to things like sales cycle length, average deal size, cost of sales, customer churn rate, and even performance to goal that's in the past. I strongly believe that instead sellers need to be future-focused and able to pay attention to leading indicators, not lagging indicators. While those lagging indicators measure past performance, leading indicators measure current and future sales opportunities and focus them then on sales activities. So you want to focus them on metrics like calls to prospects and customers, meetings with buyers, proposals being prepared and made, orders being placed, and activities that will drive customer retention. Enabling sales implies support of these leading indicators too, so it makes sense to create systems and to think about your sales culture and have everything focused on looking ahead. I want to take a little tangent. Let me just say one more thing about this disabler. It has a secondary impact if you're focusing on lagging indicators. When you spend time talking about those lagging indicators, you're probably talking about something negative, something the seller didn't do or some goal they did not reach. So a word of caution, in addition to sucking time out of the sales day, that conversation can be disabling in another way. It's deflating. And you need your sellers to be optimistic, upbeat, and future-focused so they can go out and convey confidence and positivity with clients. Well, here's another one, bureaucratic red tape, processes, extra steps, internal competition, inefficiencies. This one was reported by a lot of frustrated sellers who cited these types of sales disablers as reasons for leaving companies they otherwise enjoyed working for. In this case, let's talk about something other than the obvious time constraints, since we've been hitting that pretty hard already. One of my clients had a very tight policy about travel expenses and entertainment reimbursements. Every expense in this particular case required approval from 5 busy people who traveled, lagged behind on signing and forwarding paperwork, even when they were in the office, and they were expected to spend an inordinate amount of time spot-checking reports that had been filed and double-checking the math and so on. Now, this same company doesn't provide company credit cards. So while these expense reports are tied up in a lot of red tape, sellers had to front their own expenses. So I bet you can guess what happened. Sellers who were not getting timely reimbursement maxed out their personal credit cards and then delayed or opted out of client meetings that required travel or entertainment. This ironclad grip on processes all fueled by suspiciousness and extreme red tape, these encumbrances disabled sales. In your organization, ask, what unnecessary hoops do you require sellers to jump through? What processes are working against you? What's the impact on sales of the red tape that you have in place? And as you're thinking about that, start jotting down the ideas so that you can take them out of this Bright Talk and put some ideas into practice and start enabling your sellers. Okay, the seller survey, the next one that was revealed was this. And I don't think any of these are great surprises to you, but this one is one that sellers do to disable themselves. They get overloaded. They don't delegate to support team members. They try to juggle more than any one person ought to handle. And more, they also try to multitask on social media, multiple devices, and in a state of constant availability. I do have, by the way, another Bright Talk related to sellers and multitasking, so check out my channel, find that Bright Talk, and if you see that that's a problem in your organization, you'll find some solutions in that particular Bright Talk webinar. Okay, now back to the sellers who are juggling, multitasking. The worst part about that is that they think that's what you want them to do. So take a look around. Are your sellers trying to do it all on their own? Why? Is it a function of low quality or low quantity resources? Or do they have poor delegation skills? Or is there an unclear delineation of roles and responsibilities? Or is it call reluctance? Is this a desire to dodge selling activities? Figure it out. Whatever your answer is, it is up to you to clear their plates and to give them the right message and to get them out of this overload that they're putting on themselves so that they will be enabled to sell. And yeah, I do. I know. You're probably overloaded too. So in order to fully enable sales, you may have some work to do in eliminating whatever it is that disables you from managing and coaching your sellers. Okay, well, here's another one that's not a surprise. If you weren't muted, I bet we'd hear a collective groan or maybe even a collective cheer from this next slide. And the cheer would be because you already know that team meetings can be a problem. And you recognize that they aren't always that productive. And the groan would be because even though you know this, you haven't figured out what to do about it. This could be a topic of its own today, but I'll leave it with a question for you to ponder. In your typical team meetings, how many agenda items are focused exclusively on enabling immediate sales? And by contrast, how many of your agenda items are more related to housekeeping and may actually disable sales and could probably be communicated via email? Well, those are the first 5. According to sales reps, these are the first 5 time sucks that disable them from selling more. And as painful as this is, let's keep going. Let's face the next 5 head-on also. Keep thinking about what you can do, even small things you can do to chip away at these disablers, because every little bit does add up. 5 more time wasters, according to sellers. I think this one is interesting. Drive time. It's viewed as a necessary evil. Call it windshield time for sellers who drive, or air time for those who fly to see buyers, phone hold, music time for telesellers. It all applies. Any of that waiting, any of the in-between time getting to the next appointment. That's actually only a disabler if it's wasted time. So the question for you is, how can you help sellers maximize this time and make it a sales enabler instead? Maybe it's a blended learning approach where audio training in short segments fills up drive time. Or maybe it's that you get some voice-to-text software, or hands-free calling, or pre-approval of airline charges for Wi-Fi. It could be any number of easy, relatively inexpensive tools you provide to help make the most of this time. And of course, any reasonable way that this time can be minimized is also smart business. Keeping pure with geographic territories or encouraging more phone interactions might be a bigger time saver than you realize. Okay, now remember, this is feedback from sales reps. from sellers when they were asked what they perceived to be the biggest time wasters in their sales day. The responses that listed cold calling mainly focused on poor quality leads, poor ability to open properly, and or the hidden sales disabler known as activity metrics that we already talked about. Telesellers and SDRs seem to have a lot of activity metrics. So because of those, I've seen disablement in the form of rushed calls when sellers have an average time per call metric or a minimum number of calls that must be completed type of metric. And some of those metrics are promoting behaviors that are crippling to a sales organization. Unnecessary transfers because sellers think an inbound call will take too long. Hasty hang-ups that leave negative impressions on gatekeepers. Minimum sales made rather than probing for needs that might lead to larger orders but would take longer to talk about. What sort of cold calling enablers do you have in place? Maybe you've got predictive auto dialers. Take a look. Are they working? Are they truly enabling, or could they be disabling your team? As the dialer burns through leads and connects live answers to your sellers, are your sellers enabled or disabled when the call goes through and they must respond right away, quickly? What's it like for them to hear those clicks when they aren't quite fast enough to get to that call? By now, of course, you're picking up on the fact that anything that enables can also disable. We've got to stay really diligent about monitoring what's going on with all of the tools and technology. And that's the hardest part about sales enablement. All these great ideas, these cool new things to try, all these opportunities to offer something else to your sellers. But you have to be really focused on understanding, educating, and monitoring to ensure that the enablement you hope for is truly the outcome you're getting. Okay, we're down to the last three. I'll breeze through these pretty quickly. Crisis management is a huge disabler and time suck. It's what happens when your sellers are forced over and over again into reactive versus proactive responses. The more time you and your sellers spend in firefighting or in some other sort of save-the-day mode, the more you and they may feel heroic, but your time spent on triage and damage control is time that would better be spent on building future sales. Don't be fooled by the adrenaline rush that comes when you don your cape. Instead, get proactive and troubleshoot to reduce the amount of time that these superheroic feats are required. Ask yourself, how many times have you had to get into crisis management mode to solve the same sort of recurring problem? That's your cue. If it's happening over and over again, fix it. Fix it once and for all. Be proactive. Come up with something that will prevent the crisis from happening in the first place. This is another one, of course, you're already aware. But what is it that's keeping sales from advancing through your pipeline as steadily and reliably as they used to? What is it? And whatever your answer is that you're about to give, let me challenge you and say, I think that might be an excuse. So be careful. Be careful what you say, because your sellers will come to believe it too. Those justifications and reasons that you were about to give, they can disable sales. If, for example, you were saying, well, the economy is keeping people from buying, if you say that enough times, your sellers will say it, and they'll believe it, and they'll be disabled from trying to overcome that objection too, because they'll buy it, they'll believe it's gospel truth. Instead, get rid of the clutter in the pipeline that's stalling out your sellers, that's keeping them from going on to make other sales. To enable them, help them learn how to cut out continuances. Teach them how to get prospects to say no if it's a true no, and teach them to stop celebrating stall-outs and continuances. Make it okay for sellers to open up the pipeline so fresh, new prospects have a chance to get through. And finally, their priorities. It's disabling to a lot of sellers in a lot of places because the priorities shift so often that they become disoriented. You probably feel it too, like your head is spinning as priorities shift and new information boggles the mind every day. And your sellers, they're getting that from inside and from outside too. Their buyers' heads are also spinning with an embarrassment of options and more information than any person could possibly take in, sort out, and make sense of. To enable your sellers, be sure they have clarity about their own products and how to sell them, about your expectations, about the marketplace, about their goals, about the processes that you have prioritized, and don't make change for the sake of change. Take time to explain the changes that you do make because you've decided they truly are important enough to make. With that, let me just briefly recap the 10 biggest time wasters according to sellers: reports and paperwork, lagging indicators, red tape, overload, meetings, drive time, unproductive cold calling, crisis management, clogged pipelines, and shifting priorities. So what is it that we're going to do about all this? Please don't be disheartened, because there's actually a lot that you can do. Back to that more positive place I promised you, and I had to take you through the ringer because so many sales managers just can't see the forest for the trees. You're right in the midst of all that every day, so it's just naturally harder for you to recognize it. Now, I'm going to give you 5 strategies for keeping on track and doing more enabling with less disabling. I'll start with 2 that are obvious, and then I'll add 3 that are less obvious. Please note the defining phrases of what it means to enable, they haven't changed. On screen, I put them in a little different order to help you track what we're doing in the terminology of enabling. Keep that intent in mind as we look at these 5 things that you'll do to replace disabling actions and requirements with more enabling ones. What we're aiming for are the specific ways you're going to make a dent in disablement for your own sales team. Don't let yourself be overwhelmed by ideas of everything that should be done. Break it down to smaller and more actionable steps about the things that could be done, and in fact that you will do. Because it is your job to enable sales by clearing barriers. The biggest impact you can quickly make will come from getting rid of sacred cows and challenging the status quo processes and procedures you have in place. One really great exercise you can use is to evaluate a day in the life of a salesperson. And as you do, ask this single question about each and every activity. How much does this activity contribute in driving top-line revenue? Ask it with impunity. Declutter your mind so you're not filtering with yeah buts and pressures from non-selling entities. We already know that someone at some time felt that each of these activities was relevant, important, or useful. That's not the question that you're asking with this evaluation. You can come back to those justifications later. First, start with a pure look at the central question on screen for each and every activity that a salesperson does. Keep asking, how much does this activity contribute in driving top-line revenue? And if you can answer a lot, keep it. A little, take another look at it. Not at all, get rid of it. I'm going to give you a story. This one's a little bit more complicated, but I think it'll help you to understand why this is so important to do. This is a real example, a couple of them. First of all, think about your team meeting. If you've got your entire sales team in your weekly meeting for an hour, and your agenda includes things like reviewing the month-to-date numbers, updating the vacation calendar, reviewing the credit policy since the credit manager's been breathing down your neck, providing a little product training on an extension line, reminding sellers to update their pipeline report every day, and encouraging participation in the United Way campaign. Right, for each item on your agenda, you'd have to ask yourself, how much does this discussion contribute to driving top-line revenue? And if the answer is not at all, consider scrapping it. Weigh the ROI. A 15-minute review of the credit policy multiplied by 8 sellers in the room is 120 minutes. That's 2 hours of lost selling time. Is it worth it? What alternatives do you have that would eat up less selling time? Now, that stark example I promised you, this is from an actual sales organization that I consulted with. Happened a little while back. This is an inside sales team of 32 people. Stick with me as you hear these details unfold, because this is the kind of inspection you want to do. 32 people. Now, on this particular day, they had excess production on a perishable good that needed to be moved immediately. So basically, this was a sales blitz. And in an effort to keep people motivated, the VP of sales required an email to be written and sent to the whole team and read by the whole team after each sale. He wanted them to know about the sales and to stay on top of them so they could track the inventory. And he also followed up those emails with one of his own to the full team with congratulations and encouragement. So I observed this for 4 hours, and I tallied up the time spent on writing and reading emails. They did make 72 sales. 72 sales meant 72 emails from sellers, 72 emails from the VP. That's 144 emails in 4 hours. When sellers were doing this, they spent about 3 minutes writing the email, so that's 216 minutes right there. Each seller who received one spent about 15 seconds scanning and another 2 minutes sort of stretching and re-engaging in the sales zone after reading these mandatory emails. That's another 324 minutes per seller, or now we're up to a cumulative total on that alone of 10,368 minutes, which is 173 hours. And if you were doing that math with me, you've already deducted that this is impossible. For 32 people, each working 4 hours without a break, we've only got 128 hours available. But the report outs being requested would have taken 173 hours. The good news, if you want to call it that, is that only a few sellers complied with the command. So the sales VP, obviously well-intentioned, he genuinely thought he'd motivate and enable people with this approach. He just didn't think it through. Maybe you've got situations like that in your own sales organization. So that's why the question and exercise of evaluating ROI is so important for you to do and to do diligently. These are all little disablers. They're big enablers, though, that can come after these. And this one, striking a balance, maybe that seems a little old school, but it's effective. A sales manager I know who's been highly successful in 3 different companies with 2 vastly different industries uses this very basic approach. Her sellers have one and only one metric, and that's performance to goal. She has this one and only requirement related to sales activity. That's an absolute, unbending requirement that all sellers spend the hours from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. in customer-facing activities, sales calls, client lunches, networking events, and so on. No exceptions. That means that sellers do paperwork and planning to bookend their days. Internal departments know this, and they patiently wait for callbacks until those times a day. And they contact the sales manager and not the sellers if there's a true emergency that cannot wait to be addressed. Reports, team meetings, updates, they're all kept to a minimum. The sellers are given a lot of leeway in when and how they complete that type of work. It's not checked daily or even weekly. There is a high degree, though, of accountability and a tacit understanding that the sales manager needs cooperation within the systems. Her flexibility is not a green light for sellers to be slackers. If a seller misses goal 2 of 3 months in a given quarter, that's when the manager institutes activity standards and close tracking, plus her own coaching time with that rep. And this really, truly works. It all starts with the premise that there needs to be adequate time for selling. So to get there, you have to ask that question on screen. What % of time should be buyer-facing time? And then you need to allow for there to actually be that adequate time. You need to build the system that enables sellers to spend that much time with buyers. Enabler number 3, learning agility. For you and your sellers, learning agility is a critical competency for handling changes and ambiguity that are just a part of this profession. So start selecting and hiring for it. Build it in yourself, encourage it, publicly recognize it in your team members. To truly enable your sellers, that means making them able, equipping them, giving them power and ability. You do need for them to be agile in the way they learn and apply what they already know. Mental agility, people agility, change agility, results agility. Help them to understand what those things mean, make sure that you understand it yourself, and keep them nimble and agile in all 4 of these ways. If you haven't yet, be sure to get Jill Conrad's book, Agile Selling. It will help you to learn more about this. Enabler number 4, another basic one, but really important and probably not so obvious. In those responses that we heard from sales reps, in the fill-in-the-blank question, this is what popped up the most. If I could tell my sales manager one thing, and the most common response had to do with managers being out of touch, not listening, or not respecting what sellers had to say. Sellers, they want you to hear your ideas. They want you to hear what they bring to the table. They want you to pay attention when they're feeling shackled or distracted or pulled in too many directions. And they want your help when they begin to feel disabled, because they do want to sell more. But when you tell them things like, hey, we spent a lot of money on that CRM, so we have to use it, sellers do not care. They don't care how much the CRM costs the company. They do care about how much it's costing them, and they expect you to care about things that adversely affect them too. Enabler number 5. This one, I put it up here just to be a little provocative. Enabler number 5 is do it yourself. And if your response is, I can't, I'm already maxed out, I'm too busy, I can't add more to your plate, well, if it's not important enough for you to do, maybe it's not important enough for anyone else to be doing either. If you really think about it, is there anything you can do that is more important than liberating and enabling your sellers so they can simply sell? And I'm not being facetious when I say you might want to consider taking some non-selling work off their plate and doing it yourself, or delegating it, or hiring someone else to do it, or scrapping it all together. So please indulge this idea long enough to consider what substantial time saver you could liberate sellers from doing. What could you enable them to do instead of that task? What are some alternatives for getting this done? The easy answer is nope, they're just going to have to do it themselves. So I'm pushing you to think longer and harder about this. Go past that easy answer, see what you might be able to work out. And seriously, do that work yourself for just a week. Once you understand what's entailed and how it gets done, then you might have some additional ideas about alternative ways. Just one more thing about enablement. Sales managers, you can't do all this alone. You need enablement too. You can't enable others if you yourself are shackled to a desk filling out reports. That won't be effective enabling others, and you need to be skilled in these key sales manager skills that are critical for seller enablement. I'm alarmed by the findings of this research. This comes from the STAR Results Annual Sales Manager Survey. Here's one snapshot that indicates that there are a lot of sales managers who don't have support processes, training, and development that they need if they are themselves to be enabled to support the sales team. So if you're a sales manager, please ask for what you're needing. Your development matters. It matters greatly. And if you're a senior sales manager, I implore you to consider enabling your sales managers so they in turn will not inadvertently disable your sales team. By the way, if you'd like a copy of this complete report about support for sales manager development, there is a link in our attachment section. I encourage you to take a look at that. When you use that link, you'll get to Stephen Rosen's site, and it will give you this survey as well as a lot of great other resources that are right there for sales managers. Okay, now with our remaining time, I'll take a couple of questions, as many as I can here. If I don't get to your question, please connect with me via email or on social media so we can continue this conversation. I welcome the opportunity to provide coaching or to connect with you with appropriate resources. And as you're leaving the Bright Talk, please take a moment to check out the box for the 5-star box so others will know it's a good idea to listen into this one too. The first question is, we have every one of these disablements in our culture. Where should I start to work against the grain? That's a big answer. Okay, make the business case for change. Talk with your boss. Help them to understand why these disablements are so costly and what the lost opportunity cost is in terms of missed sales. And then go for the low-hanging fruit, things you could work on short-term to figure out what doesn't really need to be done. There are things that have low or no value. Figure out what they are and get rid of those things to start. Another question, we spent big bucks on our CRM. Yeah, we kind of talked about something like that. We spent big bucks on our CRM, and it's not enabling anybody. My sales reps hardly use it. What's your advice about that? Well, if that's the case, then you might not like my advice, but my advice would be not to use it. Until you understand the value that it has to drive sales, you're utterly unable to convince sellers that there's any good reason to use it. So I would suggest going back to the drawing board. Find the value. When you know the value, communicate that value, provide training that makes it easy for them to access the value, and then keep the value front and center. And that's not value to the company, and it's not even value to sales managers. The value of using it for the sellers. What does it mean to them? What's the benefit to them? Keep that front and center. Okay, we are out of time. Please do get in touch with additional questions. Here at People First Productivity Solutions, we build organizational strength by putting people first, and we can help you to do the same. Speaking of connections, please be sure to connect with me on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter, or Google+. My handle is on screen along with my email address. I also work in the leadership space as an executive coach, and these two disciplines, sales and leadership, they converge in my current work, which you may know is the movement to stop selling and start leading. Like most of my work, it's based in research with buyers and sellers. In fact, some of the information that I'll share with you today is based on a survey of sellers and what their managers were doing to enable them, as well as what their managers were inadvertently doing that disabled them. Now, we've all heard this ugly phrase, sales prevention manager. And unfortunately, it's becoming a fairly common phrase that I hear. And whenever I hear it in a group of sales managers, the response is that certain kind of laugh that means it's not really funny because it's just a little bit too close to the truth. So if your job is cluttered with lots of work that doesn't directly link to enabling the production of revenue, your effectiveness is compromised. Your role may have been blurred in the ways that you see there on screen. So as much as possible, get your partners in on consultant websites and in blogs and elsewhere. In this presentation, I'm planning to stick to the basics, the way that you see them presented here. So sales enablement simply means enabling sales. Any activity or effort or product that supports making sales counts as sales enablement. To enable means to make able. To give power, means, competence, or ability to make possible or easy, to make ready, to equip. Sales enablement includes the work that you and your organization do to make salespeople able, to give power to sellers, to increase the competencies or abilities of your sellers. All that fits in the examples you see there, like training and coaching. Sales enablement also means that you're making sales possible or easy. In other words, you're providing systems or processes that make it easier, not harder, to make sales. And then finally, sales enablement means that you're making sellers ready to sell, and you're equipping them for the work of selling. Some examples would be that you are providing tools, technology, and resources that prepare sellers to sell. Okay, so now we've clarified what I mean by that term, and it does. Kudos to you for being here and listening to this Bright Talk. This provocative question, are you enabling or disabling your sales team, is often the elephant in the room, and I applaud you for being open to examining this with me. Before I start, let me just say right up front that no sales manager, no sales director sets out to disable the sales team. I totally get that. What happens, though, is that well-intentioned managers with good ideas and incredible pressures to deliver results inadvertently, without even realizing that they're doing it, they sometimes disable their sellers. So that's what we're going to shine the light on. I'll review survey results with you, tell you some stories, share data, and offer you some tips to inspect and change whatever it is that's not serving you well in sales enablement. Over the past 30 years, I've been in your shoes. I've worked with thousands of sales managers and frontline sellers. I'm Deb Calvert, author of the bestseller, Discover Questions, Get You Connected, and of the award-winning blog, Connect to Sell. I train and coach salespeople and sales managers about connections with buyers and about practices that improve sales productivity. Other departments to do the support work. Focus your efforts on the more direct involvement that's necessary to create value, drive productivity, train, coach, forecast, and so on. And yes, in what you see there in red, please stop selling. Get enabled and capable salespeople to sell, and then get out of their way. Do your job so that they can do their job. If you'd like a copy of this graphic, please note that it's in the attachments file on your Bright Talk screen. There are some other goodies in there. I'll tell you about those as we go through the presentation. And if you want more information about this entire topic, take a look at my LinkedIn post. Another great resource that talks about this is Mike Weinberg's book, Sales Management Simplified. It's one that I highly recommend. Okay, we're going to come back to this whole idea of getting your job set up correctly at the end of the webinar. I just wanted to show you this to say I understand what you're dealing with, but now let's move into the main topic, and we'll make a full circle loop at the end. Back to sales enablement, defining the term. What you see in italics on the right-hand side, that's the dictionary definition. To the left are examples of activities and the sorts of things we do to provide for sales enablement. Certainly there are many, many definitions of the term sales enablement. Sound pretty simple, right? Well, defining it's the easy part. That's only the tip of the iceberg. The truth is that sales disablement is rampant, and most of the things sales managers do that disable sales are actually meant to do just the opposite. By the way, to disable means to make unable or unfit, to weaken or destroy the capability of, to incapacitate, to cripple, to make incapable. So, of course, no sales manager intends to weaken or incapacitate their own sales team. No one wants to be labeled as a sales prevention manager, but I see this happening with alarming frequency. So let's talk about why and how it happens. If you think about all those items we just listed as enablers, then we'd have to put that side by side with this moment of truth question. How many of those things, training, coaching, systems, processes, tools, technology, resources, how many of those are taking time away from selling? This really is a delicate balance. Although these are all necessary sales enablers, each one can potentially become a disabler